Thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to see familiar faces and I miss you all being in person with you. Um, so yeah, thank you for the introduction, Nick. I won't get into the background of where I come from academically. Safe to say that nowadays, most of my work is done either teaching, doing research on the side, which often falls to the bottom of the list of priorities, but mostly doing clinical work at my practice. So seeing about 20 clients a week and then training my junior clinicians. About 2 years ago, I started getting a little bored with talk therapy. As someone who's been in talk therapy myself since I was in my early 20s, um, kind of discovered that it does have its limits. And so I started looking into non-talk therapy related ways of treating mental health conditions. So that led me to EMDR. And as I was going through the training, I saw a vast potential for the integration of type into EMDR. I saw areas where the theorists kind of were blinded by their own type potentially, and started noticing nooks and crannies where we could make space for more type diversity in the application of mental health counseling theories. Because as you've heard me say many times, one of my biggest problems with the theories that we use in Western psychotherapy is that they really do take a one-size-fits-all approach. So this presentation is just kind of an expansion of the article that I was lucky to publish in Typeface in autumn. And I'll just run through a quick agenda for today's talk. I'm going to start first with a little overview of trauma and the relationship between trauma memory, and the neurobiology of stress. It's a really hot topic in psychotherapy these days. Second, I'll dive into EMDR. Hopefully, I won't be repeating too much. If any of you out there are trained in EMDR, forgive me for being kind of going over things you already know. But for those who aren't, it's really important background context to understand where these two things will intersect with one another. And then at the end, I'll get to the meat of the presentation, so the overlay of type on EMDR. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions and discussion, because this is kind of a new theory and it's evolving, and always curious to hear what people have to say about these hypotheses, and excited to see where this is going to go in the future. So let's start first with just picking a client, someone either that you've worked with or someone that you know personally, depending on what your professional context is with type. But pick someone that you're relatively certain about in as far as what their best fit type is. And I want you to think about something traumatic that they might have endured. You may know various levels of details about that, but do your best to kind of guess what we would call a negative cognition they might have associated with that experience might have been. So for example, if you know someone who's been in a car accident, a negative cognition that they might have taken away from that experience is that it's not safe to be in cars, which gets kind of generalized after the traumatic experience and makes getting in any car after that very difficult. And I want you to just kind of hold this client in mind as a prototype to apply the information that we talk about as we go through the session, just as a way to kind of have a workspace or a workspace to apply the information and learn it. Okay, so first I'll take you on a little tour of the nervous system. So the first thing we need to really understand is the interplay of the body and the brain in trauma responses and the subsequent impact it has on memory. Memories aren't just thought of in the cognitive or sort of the narrative mind. It's actually felt somatically first in autonomic processes that our body reacts to. So things are happening in the body before they even register on the level of consciousness. So we start at the very top with the nervous system. It's broken into two parts: the central nervous system, the CNS, the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, which is the body-brain information highway. And that's really kind of what we want to focus on here. And the PNS is broken into two parts: the autonomic nervous system, which we're going to focus on today. So all the involuntary responses that we have to things, such as reflexes and the release of certain stress hormones. And then the other half of it is the somatic nervous system, and that's the voluntary nervous system. So muscular skeleton. So if we decide we want to lift our foot, that's what that nervous system controls. But focusing on the autonomic nervous system, that's broken into two pieces: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And you can think of these two parts as the fight, flight, freeze response, so the thing that kind of activates in a moment of stress, And then the parasympathetic is its sort of counterbalancing force. So it kind of regulates the sympathetic nervous system. So what's important to know about this is that the processes related to the autonomic nervous system impact the storage of memory. And the storage of memory impacts our epistemology, the way we think about the world, our beliefs, the way we act, and we organize around certain things that we walk away with from trauma. And that impacts development, and I'll talk more about that in the future. So this is just sort of a little flow chart of how to think about what happens during a moment of stress. So we encounter a stressor, say, we see a lion in the corner of the room. The autonomic nervous system activates, and we release certain stress hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, and various neurotransmitters. And that does a couple things. It activates the sympathetic nervous system, so the fight, flight, or freeze response. And then it shuts off, your body automatically shuts off connections to parts of your brain that you don't need to have access to during a moment of stress. So particularly the prefrontal cortex. And that's where the executive function lives. So planning, organizing, reasoning, breaking things down, making meaning of things. We really lose access to that part of our brain because we're in a very stress-related response. All we have to do is figure out how to survive. We don't need to make meaning of a particular stressful experience when we're trying to figure out how to stay alive. And then after we respond to the stressor, which is either that fight, flight, or freeze response, we have what we think of as sort of the recovery phase of this cycle, which is where our nervous system kind of coasts to a halt. Oftentimes people will cry, they'll shut down, they'll sleep, they might get aggressive. But the response is typically all in effort to kind of complete the stress cycle that our body's gone through. And then the impact, which is more kind of the focus of this talk, is how memory gets fragmented during a stressful experience and how memories are stored in their disturbing states during these experiences that we have. So contrary to what we like to think, time does not heal all wounds. In fact, when something traumatic happens to us, it's stored in that disturbed and kind of static state. And what happens is that we internalize certain beliefs about self, others, and the world that really adaptively guide our behavior in the world around us. So we organize around these maladaptive beliefs. And in turn, our development gets inhibited because of these blocks. So the thing to remember here is that memory is really inexorably bound with trauma, and memory is also closely interrelated with development. So these neurological imbalances that happen during stress cycles lead to the incomplete processing of information when we're under stress. And what we know about research is that because trauma results in the fragmentation of these neural networks, the more fragmentation we have in the brain, the less flexible we are cognitively. And the less flexible we are cognitively, the more symptomatology we tend to see expressed. So in the form of anxiety, depression, impaired executive functioning, and all these sorts of things. So the correlation here is that the more fragmentation we have, the harder, the less resilient we are, the harder it is to learn and develop. And we know that a plastic brain means that we're more resilient, and more resilient leads to better outcomes in life in general. So the takeaway here is that trauma influences memory and memory influences development. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about EMDR. Got my nifty little graph. So if any of you have ever had EMDR, it seems kind of weird, maybe a little fringy, but essentially, Francine Shapiro developed this theory in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when she was kind of walking around a lake and moving her eyes back and forth and noticed sort of a measurable lowering in the level of her stress. And so she started doing research and found that the back and forth movement actually closely mimics what we see during the REM cycle of sleep. And during REM sleep, parts of the brain light up that actually relate to the facilitation of emotional and memory processing. So we're doing a lot of healing while we're sleeping, and EMDR tries to mimic that same process in a wakeful state. So we've done a lot of studies, a lot of fMRIs, kind of looking at what parts of the brain activate during EMDR, and they're very similar to what we see during REM sleep. Okay, so this is EMDR is broken into 8 phases that don't necessarily happen in one sitting. EMDR can take as little as 8 sessions, 2 sessions, sorry, 3 or 4 sessions, or it can stretch over multiple sessions depending on how quickly clients move through these phases. The first part is the history taking. This is where we're doing a lot of background information, determining how suitable our client is for EMDR. We do not do EMDR on clients who have dissociative disorders. But we're also identifying targets. So we're taking that detailed history and figuring out what happened in this person's life that saddled them with these maladaptive beliefs and negative cognitions, and determining what memories we need to go back to and reprocess. Excuse me. The second stage is preparation. So here we're doing some resourcing and equipping the client with some coping skills necessary for them to have at their disposals. Going back and reprocessing a memory, as you can imagine, can be a little dysregulating. And so we want to have our clients ready with tools to help contain and regulate and keep all that inside the window of tolerance while we're going through the reprocessing state. Incidentally, I'll get to this later, but this is where I see the first intersection between type and EMDR, to add a phase of type training in the preparation phase, in addition to the resourcing, which is the coping skills. The next stage is the assessment. So this is basically the queuing up the memory and getting the client ready to start the processing. So that sounds like, I want you to call up the memory and give me a screenshot of the most disturbing part of that experience and hold that image in your mind. I want you to call up the negative cognition that you associated with that experience. So I'm not safe, for example. The positive cognition, what would you prefer to believe about this experience? Something more like, that was then, this is now. And how true does that feel to you in this moment, which is what we call the VOC. So it's a scaled, we scale to see how much they believe the positive cognition before we start desensitization. The emotion they associate with that memory, the subjective unit of disturbance. So we rate the level of disturbance the client has about the memory because we track that throughout the desensitization, and then where they feel it in their body. So we queue it all up, pull up that touchstone memory, the negative cognition, where you feel that in your body, and I want you to go with it. And then we start the desensitization phase, which is where we start the bilateral stimulation. And that is done in the form of tappers. So they kind of lightly vibrate both wrists, alternating, a light bar with a light that goes back and forth, a sound that might go from one ear to the other, or even just tapping on shoulders, kind of alternating. But the idea is to tap, to do that alternating, activating both sides of the brain. So getting that bilateral stimulation going. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but there's something about activating the brain in this way that changes the way the client experiences and processes the memory and opens it up for the reprocessing. So phase 4, we go through the desensitization, we process through so that there's no negative association with the memory. Once they get there, what we call install the memory. It's not as weird as it sounds. Basically, it means that we just pair the positive cognition back with the original memory. And then we do a body scan. So we ask the client to kind of scan slowly to see if there's anything, any negative disturbance in the physical body, because we know that somatic memories are very powerful in traumatic experiences. If there is, we target that sensation and we do bilateral stimulation on it until there's no negativity. And then finally, we get to the closure phase where we sort of reflect on the process, make meaning of it, making sure that the client is regulated and emotionally stable. And then sometime after that, we come back to the memory to see if it's maintained that positive cognition and the level of disturbance is at 0. So this is a very quick explanation of how EMDR works. Now, the mechanism of EMDR is what interests me. This little model here is our best guess at why we can reprocess a memory and what it is about the bilateral stimulation that actually triggers the reprocessing mechanism. So assimilation here is synonymous with reprocessing. First, we think that the effect of the dual attention, so attending to past and present at the same time, the past memory, the present stimulation, taxes the working memory enough that it interrupts the patterned neural responses that we tend to have when we call up a negative experience. The second thing is that the generic responses we have associated to a certain experience get deconditioned because we are relaxing the sympathetic nervous system and activating the parasympathetic nervous system. So we kind of loosen things up a little bit by by kind of regulating that sympathetic nervous system response. And for what it's worth, even when you call up a memory that's traumatic, but you're not actually experiencing the trauma in the moment, your body on a much less acute level, but still kind of responds with a sympathetic nervous system reaction. So it does release cortisol, it does release adrenaline, even though you're not actually in danger in the moment, just with the recall. And then finally, it seems as though the brain state that gets induced by the bilateral stimulation reinforces the weak associations between more adaptive, cognitive, affective, and somatic associations. So we kind of tone down the patterned negative responses and make space for the brain to connect with the weaker but more positive and adaptive information. Okay. So everything I just explained is kind of what we call the adaptive information processing model. Information processing is something we see and have talked about a lot in clinical psychology. Shapiro calls it the adaptive information processing model because she was kind of focused more on how do you connect adaptive information to maladaptive information associated with a particular experience. But so the first assumption here is that the brain does want to move towards integration and health. When we cut ourselves, our body has a natural ability to kind of heal. And similarly with the brain, we just kind of have to create the conditions for the brain to heal itself, which is where the bilateral stimulation comes in. The AIP explains how we integrate new information with old memories. And again, is activated by bilaterally stimulating both hemispheres of the brain. So here comes a really complicated diagram. I'm not going to take credit for this because it comes from Shapiro's text. Don't get lost in this one. Take time later to kind of soak it up. But basically what it's showing is originally here, so the target is the blue diamond. So that's the adverse experience. It's connected to associated channels, which are the 4 dots. And that's what we think of as the maladaptive information. So it's connected to these nodes of negative associations or information networks. And as we get into the processing, because of all the things that the bilateral stimulation triggers, we sort of loosen up the connections to the negative stuff, and we start connecting to more adaptive information. And as the processing continues, you can see that it goes from red, maladaptive, to orange, more adaptive, to green, most adaptive. And by the end of processing, we have the target that's connected to almost fully green and mostly, all positive, but all adaptive information as time goes on. And just to kind of point this out here, because I'll go into it later, you can kind of see these little disconnected neural networks here. The reason why I put these on here is because the information is kind of floating around in the client's psyche. It's just not connected to the target, which is the negative experience. And so our goal is to kind of get those networks connected to the more to the target itself. Okay, the last thing you need to know about EMDR to understand the information that's coming later are cognitive interweaves. Basically, what we use cognitive interweaves for are when phase 4, which is the desensitization phase, is rolling along, the client is just moving through these neural networks and associative channels and connecting things and remembering things they forgot, and everything moves very smoothly. But sometimes the client will hit a block for a variety of reasons. They might be tired. They might have hit something especially sensitive and their psyche storing up defenses. But when a client gets stuck, we use a cognitive interweave. And basically, it's a very short but intentional statement that jumpstarts the processing. And it's something that the clinician gives to the client. Otherwise, the clinician stays almost completely out of the process. But an example of this is, so the client's associating, and you stop and you say, can they hurt you now? Go with that. You don't ask for a response. You just put the information in front of the client, and the client takes it and keeps moving in their processing with it. So the cognitive interweave is really used to elicit the adaptive material that is hopefully somewhere sitting in the client's psyche. One of my hypotheses is that it can also be used in a psychoeducational manner when you have a client who is kind of ready for making the next jump in their development. So kind of scaffolding development in this way, even though it's not something you might have prepped them with ahead of time, it's a connection that they can make on their own. And so you can kind of seed their garden, put information in front of them that they can integrate and develop in their own brain as they're going through EMDR. And that is kind of one of the bigger points that I want to make today, which is that the integrating type in EMDR is not just about making EMDR more effective, it's about priming type development at the same time, not just about healing, but also about an opportunity for development for the client. Okay. So just a quick word here. I think many of you out there are familiar with the research that I've done on the hierarchy of preferences, but I kind of want to go through it just briefly because it's informing how I'm thinking about type development. So as we know, type is an incredibly powerful tool. I think of it as a Rosetta Stone to kind of decipher who we're dealing with and how they function. So it tells us where to locate a person's system of thinking in terms of judgment and perception. And based on someone's dominant and auxiliary functions, we can really make guesses about what people value, what they think about, what they focus on, how they tend to make meaning of things, how they organize information. And so because of that, my thought is that we can also hypothesize where trauma is likely to happen for a client. So this is sort of my first draft of the trauma themes by type. And I used Kiersey's 4 types for the sake of simplicity. Hopefully in the future, it'll be even more specified into 16 types. But for now, I'm going to use the 4 temperaments. So for NFs, we're likely to see a lot of trauma happening in the area of identity. They're very focused on relationships, and they're really focused on meaning and sense of self. And so trauma is likely to land on some level of identity for them. And we'll get into specifics about that. For NTs, it's going to be about performance because they put such a high priority on capacity and mastery of things. For SP, around capacity, their ability to do things. So, thinking about an SP feeling trapped, that's probably likely to be where some of their trauma occurs. And for SJs, security, safety, order, convention. So their trauma is likely to be located around the ability to trust the world or trust others, not necessarily trust themselves. Although I should say that, these are generalities. And of course, we can have NFs that struggle with a sense of security. For instance, if we have an NF who was subjected to a lot of childhood abuse, maybe some of that trauma would be related to maybe feeling as though they were responsible for what happened to them. They could have done better. But a lot of it might be around like the world isn't safe, or adults aren't safe, or men aren't safe, or something like that. So not strict, but just general themes that I'm pointing out here. So think about the client that you thought of earlier. Think about the trauma that you identified and whether or not that aligns with this chart. If it does, yay. If not, I want to hear about it so I can further refine this model. So I look forward to hearing about that. Okay, so hopefully some of you have seen this before. This is a very, just one of the tables that I pulled out from the research I did on the typical order of the development of functions. So Myers-Briggs thought of dominant, secondary, auxiliary, tertiary, dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior. I think of those 4 functions as bookends. So the dominant and auxiliary at the very top in positions 1 and 2, and the tertiary and the inferior in positions 7 and 8. So similar to the way Lenore Thompson talks about it. So bookends to the linear trajectory of type development over time. And what my research showed was that types are more likely to develop the opposite attitude of their preferred forms of judging and perceiving. So in this example, we've got someone who might be an INFJ or an ENFJ, but they've got both attitudes of feeling, both attitudes of intuition developed over time. And we could probably talk for a whole other hour about that, but I just wanted to give that as a backdrop to how I'm thinking about type development. So again, here, the data shows that we're likely to develop both attitudes of our preferred forms of judging and perceiving. So in the example of the ENFJ, INFJ, we've got both attitudes of feeling, both attitudes of intuition. In the ISTP, ESTP, we've got both attitudes of thinking, both attitudes of sensing. Okay, let's get to the meat of the presentation here. So this is the first major intersection I see between type and EMDR. If you think back to our 8-phase model here, we're talking about this phase, phase 2. This is the preparation phase where we're doing resourcing. So these are just examples of some of the techniques that we teach: safe place, container, lots of breathing techniques, a resource team. So that might be phase 1. Part 1 of phase 2, the preparation phase. Part 2 is type training. And so what I think, so we know that clients need that adaptive information somewhere in their brain so that they can connect that, that traumatic memory with the adaptive information eventually. But I think pre-MDR, EMDR type training can happen in phase 2 to do a couple things. Number one, to plant the adaptive information, but to also prime them for the ability to let me go back. To number one, to promote the healing that happens during EMDR, but number two, to promote the potential for development during EMDR as well. So the first part of this would involve, number one, figuring out what is their best fit type, who am I working with? The second part here is what does their dominant and their auxiliary function look like? Are they working well? Is one being overdeveloped? Is one being underused? Is one, are they working well in tandem with each other? And then take a temperature on the other complementary functions. So these functions, so the other attitudes of their preferred forms of judging and perceiving. So for the INFJ, it would be introverted feeling or extroverted intuition. And just take a temperature and see, where am I seeing that show up for them? Am I seeing it used defensively? Am I seeing it used functionally? And then, of course, you always want to look at the inferior functions because that tells you where dysfunction in the top half of the stack is. If you're seeing the inferior or the tertiary function come out in dysfunctional ways, like for me, it's my scheduling, it tends to be my indication that my intuition has run so far ahead of me. It's just leading the show and dragging my auxiliary function along with it. And then from there, you get a good picture of where someone's development is. And you can decide what needs to be toned down, and then what needs to be primed. So if you've got, for example, an INFJ whose introverted intuition, or INTJ, whose introverted intuition is way out of control, you want to tone the introverted intuition and prime the opening to use the extroverted thinking or the extroverted feeling. And so in this little chart here, I've just put a couple examples of what that might look like. And I think this can be done in the form of coaching, something that people here are probably very familiar with. Psychotherapy, because I'm a therapist, I kind of think of them in more psychotherapy terms. So I put a few interventions here that I would typically use. So if I'm trying to tone that introverted intuition, I would use psychoeducation and say, you're often talking about the exceptions or how this is not right or what's missing from this picture. But let's talk about what's the most likely explanation for this. So just kind of trying to tone the introverted intuition down. Or another way to approach that would be a question like, well, what could you be missing here if that introverted intuition is the thing that you're trying to tone? So I gave a couple other examples here, and hopefully, as time goes on, I'll develop a fuller compendium of different types of interventions aimed at toning and priming all of the 8 functions. Okay. So here's the next kind of the next important thing is the type-informed cognitive interweave. So again, just to remind you, we use cognitive interweaves to jumpstart the processing when the client is stuck or they're looping. And it's used again to elicit that adaptive material and kind of wake it up as they're in the process of as they're processing the memory. You drop the material right in front of them so they can associate those two things and create the bridge. So if we know what a certain type is, what a certain person's type is, and we know where their trauma is located, and we know what their negative cognitions would tend to be, we can also generate cognitive interweaves that are specified to help the client get to that adaptive state of resolution. So type-specific cognitive interweaves, essentially. And just to kind of illustrate what I have in mind here, imagine if you're working with an SJ and you're just constantly delivering interweaves that are about their sense of identity. And, maybe somewhere in the SJ's mind, they're thinking like, you don't get this. It's not about me. It's about the fact that I failed my community or I failed my partner. It's not, I'm not bad. It's that I failed. I failed them. And so you would really miss someone if you were delivering the wrong kind of adaptive information for them. And, in the corollary, you would really hit things home if you got the right cognitive interweave at the right time for the right person. So here I've kind of started to, again, this is draft number 1, but lay out the typical negative cognitions that we would see based on type. So remember that NFs, identity, NT, performance, SP, capacity, SJ, safety. If we look at that first quadrant on the top left, NF, identity-related trauma, I'm not worthy, I'm defective, I'm no good, I'm worthless, these sorts of things about their sense of self, their sense of worth. And again, remember that these negative cognitions get integrated in a moment of trauma, and that can be something as small as a parent saying it to them enough times, or something as massive as, being abandoned by a parent. But the idea is that this belief gets integrated into the client's ontology, and then they organize themselves around it. And for the NF, they organize their identity around that, and that's what becomes maladaptive and sort of inhibits development. So again, here for the NT around performance, I'm powerless, I'm a failure. For the SJ, I'm not safe, the world's not safe, other people aren't safe, I failed. And then for the SP, I'm trapped, I'm stuck, or I failed as well. And I'll get into some more detail in just a second. And again, here's another crazy chart. Don't let it scare you. I also wanted to, what's difficult here, this is sort of the third integration, so the cognitive interweave. So specifying the cognitive interweave to type. What's hard to sort of taxonomize which cognitive interweave to use according to type is that it really depends on where the processing is and what the trauma was. And so I've kind of just laid them all out here for you as sort of a library of things that you can start to refer to start kind of correlating or mapping, depending on, basically it's just a bank of cognitive interweaves that you can come and use depending on what you want to touch on at a particular time in the processing. As you can see, there are several different kinds of interweaves. We've got just dropping new information. So we would think of that as psychoeducation. You can start with, I'm confused. So I'm confused. Were you supposed to know what to do as a 3-year-old in that situation? Questions, whose responsibility was it? Choice interweaves, can't see it because my image is too small. Safety interweaves, are you safe now? Responsibility interweaves, whose responsibility was it to blank? Let's pretend, so you kind of put a fantasy situation in the client's head, and then metaphor and analogy. She was like the hungry ghost that just couldn't get enough. And the way this works in the actual processing is that your client is processing, they're kind of giving you, now I'm thinking of this, and then this happened, and that happened, and then they get stuck, and then you say, humans have an innate sense of what they need, and that's worth trusting. Go with it. And then they go right back into the processing and keep moving along. So again, it's not a conversation that happens during the EMDR processing. You just drop the information into the client's brain. And just to go through a couple examples here, again, I mentioned this one already, but the green, new information. So again, humans have an innate sense of what they need, and that's trustworthy. So this would maybe be appropriate for an NF who struggles with identity or self-trust. In yellow, the safety interweaves. Are you safe now? Go with that. That could be something related to use that for an SJ around trauma around safety. In lilac, the responsibility interweaves. Were you supposed to know what to do? You could use that with an NT around working on their sense of performance. And then in aqua, let's pretend you could rewrite that ending, maybe with an SP who's dealing with trauma around feeling stuck. Okay, so this is sort of the map, essentially. So I've got those negative cognitions on the box on the left, and then I've got the positive cognition on the right. So that's where they start on the left, and the positive cognition is where they want to go. And ideally, with effective reprocessing, you replace the negative cognition with a positive cognition, and you use the cognitive interweaves in the steps in between to get them there. And again, these are really just general patterns. There are exceptions. But again, we're just trying to kind of taxonomize the patterns in what we would expect according to type. Okay, I'll jump into the 4 temperaments, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So here we have the NF. Kiersey said that they were idealists who value identity over stimulation, recognition over generosity, and sage over the virtuoso. NFs want everybody to be happy and to feel good. Some adjectives that we would use are intuitive, sensitive, romantic, altruistic. And what we tend to see, and sample bias, but most of my clients are NJs, so NFs and Ts. Most often tend to see struggles around a sense of self-worth, feeling as though they're selfish, feeling unwanted or disconnected to others. But they can also get caught in a sense of existential dread related to a loss of hope in humanity. So they also tend to feel very affected by what's happening in the world and suffering and that sort of thing. So a lot of their trauma is probably going to relate to a sense of being unlovable, maybe being too much. And the cognitive interweaves that we'll use here are meant to sort of tone their extroverted judgment. So in this case, extroverted feeling, and prime their introverted judgment, introverted feeling, and replace that with a positive cognition around, I am worthy, I trust in myself, I trust in the universe, the world is a good place, and I am good. And so that's what, the sort of what we would look for in helping an NF heal from trauma related to identity. Here we move to the NT. So here we have rationals that are not only logical and contemplative, but they're always absorbed in some kind of scientific inquiry, investigation into complexity and probing into the nature of things. Those are Kiersey's words. NTs really value being good at things in a similar way to SPs, but they place value in competence and mastery of intellectual tasks most of the time. So some of the words we have are analytical, strategic, curious, abstract. NTs are the most self-critical of all types. So my thought is that trauma is probably going to be personalized around issues around self-worth. And the trauma will center around threats to their sense of ingenuity or maybe even autonomy or competence, even performance. And then the other kind of subtle thing that I don't see quite as often anecdotally in my practice is this sense of isolation. So a feeling that no one can understand them because nothing can be known. So maybe some trauma relating to that. And then we get things like I'm alone or I'm a failure. And so the direction that we want to move them in is a positive cognition around I can find ways to be connected or feel connected to people, and everything's going to be okay. Failure is a part of mastery and these sorts of things. Here we have the SJ who prioritizes safety and order. They're loyal, traditional, collective, protective. They are the guardians of everything: people, institutions, tradition, structure, convention, order. They're usually concerned with very serious things. They trust authority, yearn to belong to groups, prize the expression of gratitude. Those are Kiersey's words. And so their negative cognitions are going to tend to cluster around a loss of safety or order, potentially a failure in a sense of duty or an obligation they had, potentially a loss of faith in the state of the world, maybe being unable to trust people who are in order, in control, or in power. And it's kind of subtle and again, less often observed, but maybe feeling unappreciated can be another trouble area for them. But that I think can kind of be connected to a sense of a loss of trust in people or the world around them, not in what ends up happening. Feeling unappreciated for NTs and NFs can be personalized. So it can be sort of like a form of self-recrimination, but for SJs, it's a sense of loss of hope in the order of things in the world that they live in, which they very much need. So here we're going to have negative cognitions that sound like I'm not safe, I'm not in control, or I failed, which I want to note here is very different from I'm a failure. I'm a failure has to do with identity. I failed has to do with a duty or a responsibility that they had. And so here, their cognitive interweaves are going to potentially tone their extroverted judgment. So their extroverted feeling or their extroverted thinking, and maybe prime the extroverted perception or the introverted judgment. So things like, I am safe now, which helps them distinguish the past from the present, because those two things can become confounded for SJs. Or it wasn't my responsibility. So you prime their ability to discern what they can control from what they can't. And last but certainly not least are the SPs. Adjectives come to mind here: dynamic, spontaneous, action-oriented, impulsive. In Kiersey's words, what they do best is work in their environment and move in a tactical way. They base their self-confidence on their ability to adapt spontaneously to changing circumstances and to alter and shape their behavior according to what the moment demands. And so their negative cognitions are going to potentially look like a depressive state characterized by a loss of hope, like there's nothing out there for me, or this is all there is. And then, of course, a sense of being confined and unable to exercise impulse, unable to move through the world, unable to have an impact on the people and the things outside of them. So here, I'm trapped, I'm stuck, or I failed somehow. And then the cognitive interweaves, sort of the positive cognition that we want to move them towards are, I have choices. There might be an option I'm not thinking of, and I'm capable. I see that others can do this. I can do it too. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, we've got, I think, about 15 minutes left. I'm just going to kind of go through the main conclusions here, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about some questions, or even just, the clients that you were thinking about as we were going through the information. But 3 main points. Number 1, trauma impacts memory. Memory impacts development. Number 2, EMDR is a well-validated and powerful treatment that really harnesses the nervous system to activate the brain's natural tendency to heal. And I should have put this on there and I didn't, but EMDR is not just an opportunity, integrating EMDR and type is not just an opportunity to heal, it's an opportunity to prime development. And finally, the 3 main areas for overlapping these 2 theories are in the preparation phase or on the type training, in our ability to better locate where traumas are and what the negative cognitions resulting from those traumas were, and then selecting the appropriate positive cognitions and cognitive interweaves to facilitate and make that process more effective. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully there's a book somewhere in here if I could find some time to write, but that's what I got. So I'm interested in some thoughts and questions. And Nick, I'll turn it back over to you. I don't know if you want to just open the floor up to everybody and have people chime in. I think you're on mute, or I can't. Oh, I lost audio from Nick. Can everyone hear Nick, or is it just me? Okay.
No, can't hear me.
I think we lost your audio.
Should I help out then and just open
Okay,
up for
can you hear me?
questions?
There we go.
You're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that. These are new headphones. Thank you so much, Mina. That was a really interesting presentation. Yeah, I guess we'll just hand over the floor. I don't see any questions in the chat. There was a comment from Catherine Hirsch, but I guess if anybody has some questions or comments, please go ahead.
I've got a question, Mina. You said that as part of your as part of your process, you introduce the clients to type. Is that you take a guess on their type, so you think about how to work with them, or do you explicitly teach them about type?
Yeah, so I think, yes, short answer, I don't explicitly mention type, partially because we often don't have time, partially because it's really complex, partially because people who come to therapy tend to get turned off by it, which is something that hurts my heart deeply. So I think it's something that more informs how I'm thinking about type, which also kind of puts me in a bit of a wind tunnel because I'm guessing their type. So I'm doing my best job trying to figure out what type they are. I do have a little bit of an advantage because there is sort of a modal type that comes into counseling. So it's an NJ, so NFNT. We get some SJs as well. But yeah, it is a kind of a potential drawback for me because I don't have the client's input directly around best fit type.
Mm. But you sort of take your best guess and sort of position it that way.
Yeah, and sometimes when I can't get their 4-letter type code, I go with things like NJ or SJ. You know, I go to the Kiersey model. I kind of like collapse the typing models when I don't feel confident about the 4-letter type code.
Cool.
Thank you.
Great. Mina, do you mind unsharing your screen so we could
Oh,
see
sure.
everyone? Yeah,
Yes,
thank
yes.
you. Great. That's better.
Mina, this is Joe. I've got a question.
Nice to meet you.
The cognitive interweaves, are they like cognitive affirmations? And how do they fit into the process of EMDR? Is it that you're doing the eye movement at the same time you're reading these things out to them, or they're playing them in their mind? I just wonder in a real sense how it's being done.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I should have done a quick sample of what it tends to look like. So the cognitive interweaves are not always an affirmation. They can be a question. They can be a piece of psychoeducation. They can be an affirmation depending on what you want to use at what time. But the way it works is you'll cue up that memory. So think of that screenshot, think of the negative cognition, notice what you feel, go with it. We turn on the stimulation, it goes for a little while and it's quiet. The client's processing internally. We stop it, we say, what came up for you? The client gives you sort of a headline of, I thought of this, then I went there, and then this happened. And then you say, okay, go with that. Turn the stimulation on again. That happens enough. Client starts to get stuck. When I say go with that, and the client says, I did the same thing again, I'll say, it wasn't your responsibility. Go with that. Turn on the stimulation. So it's kind of in one of the check-in periods between the rounds of the stimulation.
Can I ask a question? I'm just wondering a little bit about the whole sort of timing in terms of, are we in the past, the present, or the future? As an NT myself, and I've also done EMDR in the past. I think one of the most important things for me, I'm somebody that ruminates and looks at things and constantly works out, what I could have done better. I'm a perfectionist and constantly, revisiting things, analysing them to death, and trying to understand where I might have made mistakes or and so on. So I actually think in working with EMDR and also being obviously a practitioner in type, I think one of the important things for me was actually not to switch into too many analytical techniques. I mean, type for me is an analytical technique. So the more I might have got lost in that may have actually prevented me from staying in the now. This back to this idea of time frames, because very much EMDR was about processing feelings, obviously not necessarily my strengths as an NT, but equally staying in real time. Could you say a little bit about timing and this process in terms of, where do you want the client to be, the past, the present, or the future? Because some of those questions looked almost like future oriented, some were present, some were past. How important is that in terms of linking how you actually use EMDR and the actual types of the personalities that you're working with?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm glad there's someone in the room who's done EMDR, so it can kind of feel like it comes to life. So 2 thoughts on that. When we think of a traumatic experience, we think of this sort of, if you think of like a circle with lines coming off of it, that experience is connected to beliefs, thoughts, affect, values, sensations. So lots of different associative channels connected to a traumatic experience. When we start the bilateral stimulation and activate that information processing, what we want to do is just let the brain associate through all of those channels until it's processed all of the negativity associated with that memory. If that involves going into the past, that's okay. We let that go. And then the second thing, I completely forgot. I think that the last question you asked was the timing. Oh, thank you. Sorry. So the positive cognitions are future oriented because what we know or what we think about maladaptive beliefs is that there are experiences in the past that we are generalizing to the current life experience that are maladaptive. And so we do kind of want to have this forward thinking cognition. I wasn't safe then, I am safe now. And it is very present and future oriented. Did that answer your question?
Partially, I think, not fully. So in reality, in a session in EMDR, and certainly I was told as an NT that EMDR works particularly well with NTs, and it really was an incredibly helpful therapy. But for me, it was really important to stay in the present and to keep myself as much in the present as possible and not to ruminate too much into the past, to constantly revisit. I'm thinking a little bit about linking it to things like imposter syndrome. So I have this drive for perfectionism, but equally analysis paralysis, constantly revisiting situations and trying to extract meaning from them or learnings from them. And that can be really almost quite obsessive behavior that is actually not very fruitful. So the importance of not going too much into the past. But as an NT, most of my life is played out in the future anyway. I'm always thinking about new options, new possibilities, new ways forward, new scenarios, and so on. So for me, a lot of the power of it as an NT was not ruminating, looking at the past and constantly analyzing it all, obviously using my auxiliary function, and not going too much into future projections of, where it can go from now in terms of different scenarios and options. It was a lot of the importance of the therapy was actually in staying in the now, which is my least preferred time frame, if you see what I mean.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering to what extent that is important, particularly if we're trying to link EMDR as a therapy, because certainly my therapist did not link it at all to type.
Yeah.
She is not a proponent of Jungian theory or anything else. So, we had some interesting discussions about various things, but she didn't link it to type. But in many ways, what was really powerful was the fact that I was forced to stay in my least preferred time frame, which is the now.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of so the way I was trained was you just let the brain do its thing. You kind of get out of the way, you let it associate in whatever ways it wants to for as long as it wants to, because eventually, even if you're kind of stuck in the past, you do want that adaptive information to connect with whatever whatever got kind of glued in your brain as a result of those adverse experiences. But I think to what you're saying, I have seen situations where clients can hide and they start looping in these sort of past oriented experiences or even future oriented experiences like you're saying. And a potential cognitive interweave would be to kind of bring them into the present and say, you are safe now, you have choices now, and to kind of move them along a little bit. So I think if you're framing it in terms of that my processing would get stuck, I would start looping because I was ruminating on something and I needed something to kind of get me out of that neural network system, that's where an appropriate cognitive interweave would come into play. So I think I see the connection that you're making there.
Yeah.
I think I saw Catherine, did you have your hand up a few moments ago?
I did. I was just curious whether you've looked at the suggestion that Dario Nardi's made, Mina, that our neurotic behaviors come from the third function, whether that might have some impact on what kinds of choices you make in helping people get out of those negative beliefs.
And are we talking about the tertiary function as we would think of in the four?
Yeah, sorry. Yes.
Okay. I have not, but I think we kind of know that dysfunction gets expressed in the tertiary and the inferior function. So that would make a lot of sense to me. I haven't sat down to think about, like, if I'm working with an INTP, like what does it look like when well, actually I do know what that looks like. My brother-in-law it's as an INTP, as you probably remember. But yeah, where the intersection is with the EMDR stuff, I think there's a lot of potential for, again, like locating what we would think of as problematic behavior related to trauma, potentially. Thank you.
Mina.
Hey, David.
Hi. Fascinating stuff as usual. You're talking about bilateral stimulation through the arms, other things. Obviously, eye movement was the original impetus. How much do you see it tied to visual stuff, and how much is it just bilateral stimulation of the brain, do you figure?
That's a really interesting question. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of the research around what's happening and why, and whether there's a particular type of stimulation that works better. So the question is, okay, sorry, can you repeat your question? I want to make sure I'm on track. My brain.
How much is it about eye movement, and how much is of it is just bilateral stimulation of the brain, I guess?
I got you. So not
Like-
necessarily related to looking, but just activating both sides of the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I would tend to agree. It's just about activating, getting both sides of the brain going. I mean, I think about things like when I run and, I move my arms back and forth and my feet go back and forth. It's got this sort of meditative quality where both sides of my brain are activated. So, I actually find that with most clients, the eye movements are very distracting. So it takes a lot of concentration to look at something going back and forth and kind of use your visual imagination to go into a memory. And more often I use tappers or just sound because they can close their eyes and go into the imaginary space in their mind and play with a memory that way. So yeah, I actually don't like using eye movements, but and now that I think about it, like we have our eyes closed during REM sleep. So it's not like we're actually looking at things. Our eyes are just going back and forth. So
Right. Well, I really resonated with your comment about getting whatever you said, bored or tired with talk therapy. I mean, I think there's this huge amount to talk therapy. I come out of my history is actually with body work. And I find even, if I'm on the table being worked on, like it's always surprising to me how much emotion can be involved in some of that. And I do wonder how much of it is reintegrating into my brain and just
yep.
muscle memory, the storage of who we are in our bodies. So it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, thank you. It's one of the big things that we've been talking about a lot in the last 10 years in psychotherapy, as you probably know. There is so much, it's like an iceberg. There is so much happening under the surface of conscious awareness. And we like to think it's all, we're pulling all the levers up here. But, especially like when it comes to a memory, it's actually felt in our body before it actually comes into the mind. And that's why so much of the nervous system is being integrated into therapy and figuring out how to help people heal from things. So.
I think if I could just make a comment, I mean, I went into therapy because literally the thing well, a couple of things triggered it, but one was a sense of not being whole. And that's the best way I could describe it. I didn't feel that I was whole. So I think in many ways, for me, linking it back to type is really about things like unknown shadow, really sort of somehow integrating the different parts of the personality, and that some of mine were massively overdeveloped and some of them were massively underdeveloped. And that in many ways, finding EMDR, which I find it because Eve DeLunas recommended it to me, which was the most fantastic recommendation she could ever have made at the conference in the US in 2017.
Yes, 17,
yeah. And so I started it in 2017, and I think in many ways I love what you said today about development. I have, since I started doing EMDR in 2017, and obviously I've been a type practitioner since the late 90s, for my own personal growth, I have said it's massively accelerated my own personal growth in the last 7 years. I just see that as just, through this combination of knowledge of type, but equally of the EMDR process, to try and to integrate the different aspects of my own personality into a whole person. And I say, I came to type in search of wholeness. I remember saying to my therapist, I don't really know what I mean by this, but I don't feel whole, and I want you to try and help me to find my wholeness, as it were. The development opportunity has been massive. So, there's very interesting what you've said today. I can't quite fit it all together. I need to go away and think about it in some detail. But I think you're definitely onto something in terms of rapidly accelerating development and equally, integrating the unowned shadow, which I think is absolutely crucial work. This, in terms of the work that I do in coaching, a lot of that is around, integration of the shadow. And I think this could be one of those sort of important elements in that process.
For sure. Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm always excited to have conversations about this. So if people have ideas out there, or yeah, this triggers some thinking, get in touch with me. I don't think I showed, well, hopefully my email is somewhere out there, but
Yes, it is. It's on the website, so we can share it. If anybody needs, get in touch with me or Mina herself, and we'll make sure you have her email address. Sorry to bring things to a close.
I really
Thank you
appreciate
so much,
it.
Mina.
It's good to see everyone.